With the lessons about small and slow carriers versus large fast carriers now learned from Langley versus Lexington, the U.S. committed to large carriers. So, in 1933, the U.S. began work on its next class, taking into account all of the lessons learned while still remaining within treaty limits. These were the first two ships of the 19,800-ton Yorktown Class. With World War II on the horizon, however, in 1938, the Navy needed to grow quickly to meet the fast-approaching threat. Two new classes were in the works, but to speed production, a third ship, Hornet, was authorized. Work began only days following the start of the war. She was a near repeat of her sisters. Probably the largest differences were the fitting of the new and better Mark 37 Director rather than the older Mark 33 her sisters had, along with a revised bridge. These were excellently balanced carriers, the best of their time. Aircraft handling was better than the much larger Lexingtons or smaller Ranger due to being purpose-built and using the experience of the previous ships. As a result, real air group size rose. The flight deck was longer than Rangers, but obviously not Lexington's, to handle the heavier and larger aircraft than on the drawing tables. There were two catapults at the bow. With its distinctive tripod, the island was also excellently laid out. Ship handling, air operations, and spotting fire control could all be comfortably accommodated. The high stacks kept smoke out of the flight pattern and gave a good visual reference for landing while negligibly affecting airflow. While still in deck, the three elevators were distributed further apart, bow, midship, stern, to prevent congestion during air operations. They were also larger. The hangar, which was actually larger than Lexington's, was more open to allow aircraft to be run up there. This also helped prevent concussion and fire from being bottled up, which caused heat damage to be compounded. Burning aircraft in the hangar could also be pushed overboard through the openings. Due to their use of hangar and flight deck as superstructure rather than part of the hull, along with excellent damage control, such as being able to blow gas vapor out of the lines with CO2, they could absorb even heavy damage and be operational again in an astounding time. Keeping the hangar and flight deck as light superstructure also lowered the center of gravity, making these ships very stable platforms for aircraft to take off from and land on, even in rough weather. New also to the hangar deck was a pair of catapults that could launch aircraft through the hangar openings on either side behind the forward 5-inch guns. This was seen as a way of launching scout planes without disrupting operations on the flight deck, or if the flight deck got damaged, or to speed up launching of a full strike. It was the U.S.'s answer to foreign nations' dual-deck carriers. The aircraft workshops were spacious, well laid out, and well supplied. They also readopted the use of 4 propellers, mitigating the chance of a torpedo hit leaving the ship circling. Speed rose back up to a more useful 33 knots. Turning radius was also good for a ship of their size. Reserve diesels were fitted to provide electricity in case the main generators were knocked out. Bomb stowage increased, and torpedoes could again be carried from the outset. Armor, subdivision, and structural strength were also much improved over Ranger. Some have criticized their underwater protection as inadequate. I am not one of them. Yes, later carriers had better, but they were also larger and heavier, leading to better all-around protection. None suffered underwater damage on the level of the 2 Yorktowns that were sunk. Even then, the 2 that were sunk died hard, very hard, as we shall see. Of the 3, only Enterprise survived the brutal first year of the war. Despite being outclassed by the larger and newer carriers in the second half of the Pacific War, she remained a valuable and effective fleet carrier, continuing to serve on the front lines right up to the end of the war. Post-war, it was only the introduction of much heavier jets, more numerous newer carriers, and the slashing of the Navy's budget that rendered her obsolete. Yorktown was started May 21, 1934 and completed September 30, 1937. Enterprise was started July 16, 1934 and completed May 12, 1938. Hornet was started September 25, 1939 and completed October 25, 1941. Main armament was 8 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single open mounts. Again, these were carried in pairs near the four corners of the ship. Propulsion was provided by 9 boilers venting to the funnel built into the island structure. These provided steam to 4 turbines which produced 120,000 horsepower. Each turbine, in turn, drove one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 33 knots. A single rudder was used for steering. Protection was good for a carrier of their size and time. Side armor was up to 4.5 inches, tapering down to 2.5 inches. 4-inch bulkheads formed the ends of the armored box. The flight deck wasn't armored, but the hangar floor had up to 1.5 inches. The engine rooms were well divided. From front to back, first was 3 rows of 3 boilers, each in its own compartment. Next came the forward engine room that housed the 2 turbines that ran the outer shafts. Behind it was the rear engine room that housed the turbines that ran the inner shafts. On either end of the boiler room, turbine room compartments was a generator room. The TDS ranged from 2 layers near the bow through 3 layers outside the boilers. It then deepened to 4 layers abreast the turbines and 5 layers along the aft generator room before slimming back to 4 layers. They were double-bottomed. The flight deck was 802 feet by 86 feet on the first 2. On Hornet, this was increased to 814 by 86 feet. There were 2 flight deck catapults. There were 3 in-deck elevators, 1 forward, 1 midship, 1 aft, that were 48 by 44 feet. The hangar was 546 feet long by 63 feet wide by 17.25 feet high. That is to say, 2, actually 3 decks worth. Continuing the practice from Ranger, forward of the hangar proper was the 3 levels of aircraft workshops. These stretched from in front of the forward elevator to the rear of the open bow. There was also a twin hangar catapult that could launch aircraft out either side through the hangar openings just behind the forward 5-inch guns. Also carried over was the ability to suspend disassembled aircraft from the hangar roof. Aircraft complement was generally in the mid-70s during the first year of the war. When more and better aircraft became available, Enterprise's complement would raise to the low 90s. A typical air group during the first year of the war was about 25 fighters, 37 dive bombers, and 15 torpedo planes. Later, Enterprise would carry about 39 fighters, 34 dive bombers, and 19 torpedo planes. Modernizations were light before the war. They were already modern and didn't need any major work. In December of 1941, before transferring to the Pacific, Yorktown and Hornet received the new 20mm. Enterprise traded her 50 caliber Brownings for the 20mm in late May before heading to the Battle of Midway. After the Battle of Midway, in June of 1942, Enterprise was modified to carry the new and much heavier TBF Avenger. They also had their hangar deck catapults removed. It was superfluous. Between the battles of Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, Enterprise began trading her 1.1 medium AA for the newer 40mm. Enterprise was constantly upgraded throughout the rest of the war, most notably in July through October of 1943. Mark 37 directors replaced the older Mark 33. Mark 51 directors for the 40mm were added. The bridge was altered. A combat information center was added in the island. New sprinklers and an independently operating fire main were fitted. Bulges on both sides running from behind the forward 5-inch gun to in front of the rear 5-inch guns were added to increase the depth of the TDS, increase fuel capacity, and maintain buoyancy. The flight deck was lengthened 18 feet. The arresting gear and catapults were updated. Standard displacement rose to well over 21,000 tons. In 1944, the bow arresting gear was removed. As with other ships, her light and medium AA, along with radar, were constantly upgraded. Yorktown was at Norfolk on December 7, 1941, as part of the so-called Neutrality Patrol in the Atlantic. Receiving an overhaul, she transferred to the Pacific at the start of January 1942. After escorting a convoy to Samoa, a task which took most of January, she raided the Gilberts before returning to Pearl Harbor in mid-February. Having resupplied, she headed to the Coral Sea, where she joined with Lexington in attacking Japanese forces at Lae and Salamaua on March 10, 1942. Remaining in the area to deter Japanese expansion, on May 3rd, her aircraft raided the soon-to-be-famous Tulagi and Gavutu, sinking a destroyer and some smaller ships in the process. 4 days later, on the first day of the Battle of the Coral Sea, her aircraft helped sink the light carrier Shoho. The next day, 2 of her bombers hit the large carrier Shokaku, heavily damaging her. At nearly the same time, Yorktown was attacked by aircraft from Zuikaku. Near missed about a dozen times, she was hit in the middle of her flight deck. The bomb penetrated deep into the ship and caused considerable damage. With both sides' carriers having been damaged and their air groups depleted, the battle essentially ran out of steam. Yorktown, her flight deck holed and her hull leaking fuel, headed to New Caledonia for temporary repairs before setting out on the long voyage to Pearl, finally arriving May 27th. Upon arrival, she went right into dry dock and repair work began. At first, it was estimated repairs would take 2 months. A day later, this was revised down to 2 weeks. Amazingly, 48 hours after being dry docked, she was again ready for action. Though, to be fair, much of the damage had yet to be put right and workmen were still on board. Nonetheless, she collected her air group and headed for Midway. During the Battle of Midway, on June 4, 1942, after her torpedo squadron was mauled, her dive bombers found the Japanese carrier Soryu, hitting her 3 times and mortally wounding her. 3 hours later, dive bombers and fighters from the remaining Japanese carrier Hiryu found Yorktown, hitting her 3 times in addition to one of the damaged planes crashing into her flight deck. One bomb crashed through the forward elevator and penetrated 4 decks before exploding in a storage locker, starting a fire near the bow. A second hit near the number 2 elevator and exploded on contact, killing men on the flight deck and sending shrapnel into the hangar. The third hit crashed through the flight deck and hangar and exploded near the boiler uptakes, destroying 2 boilers and extinguishing 5 others. It also caused the ship, especially the engine room, to begin to fill with smoke. Now operating on only 2 boilers, speed dropped to 6 knots. Half an hour later, she went dead in the water altogether. Incredibly, only an hour later, 2 hours after taking 3 heavy bomb hits on top of the not fully repaired ones suffered a month earlier, she had her fires out, was making 20 knots, and was operating aircraft. Then the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived, this time torpedo planes. 2 torpedoes hit her port side, jamming her rudder, knocking out power, and causing her to take on a 26-degree list. With no power and listing heavily, the abandoned ship was given, and her airborne aircraft were diverted to Enterprise and Hornet. Still, the abandoned ship, listing heavily, stayed afloat throughout the entire night. When dawn came, salvage parties transferred over and went to work. All morning and into the afternoon, they kept at it, eventually putting her back on an even keel and started towing her back to Pearl. At 3:40 p.m., however, she was hit by 2 submarine torpedoes from I-168, a third hitting and sinking the assisting destroyer Hammond. To add even more injury, as the destroyer sank beneath her, its depth charges went off, acting like a mine hit. Yet again, she was abandoned. Yet again, she stayed afloat. All night. Finally, at 7 a.m. the next morning, June 6th, she rolled over and sunk, having taken a total of 4 bombs, a suicide plane, 2 aerial torpedoes, 2 submarine torpedoes, and effectively having been mined. In 1998, her wreck was discovered by Dr. Robert Ballard and his crew. Despite the damage and years, she essentially sits upright and in good shape, awaiting the day the seas will give up their dead. Enterprise. You know, rather than going through the Big E's tireless, record-breaking, highly decorated career, I'm going to direct you to the show Battle 360, USS Enterprise. It does a better job of covering the career of the most decorated ship to fight in World War II than I could hope to do. It's a long watch, but worth every second of it. While I'm at it, I can't forget to mention cv6.org. Check it out. While most of her was scrapped post-war, some bits do still exist. Perhaps the most relevant is her nameplate, which is at Rivervale, New Jersey. Hornet was at Norfolk doing post-commissioning workup when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In February, still training in the Atlantic, she experimentally launched 2 B-25s off her flight deck. She finally transferred to the Pacific in late March when she arrived at the West Coast. At the start of April, while still at the West Coast, she loaded 16 B-25s and set sail for a seemingly impossible mission: to bomb Tokyo. A week and a half later, she met Enterprise well north of March, and together they headed west with their escorts. On the morning of March 18th, after being spotted by a Japanese trawler, all 16 bombers launched sooner than planned and started the 600-mile journey to the Japanese capital. The carriers, in turn, came about and headed back to Pearl Harbor, making a clean getaway. Sailing again on April 30th, the two carriers headed southwest, but couldn't make it in time to take part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. So, after making sure to be seen operating the South Pacific, they returned to Hawaii, arriving on May 26th. 2 days later, they set sail, this time northwest again, preparing for the Battle of Midway. At Midway, Hornet's torpedo planes tried to attack the Japanese carriers single-handedly and were historically slaughtered. No planes and only one pilot survived. Her bombers and fighters never found the Japanese carriers, but did take part in sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma 2 days later. She missed the initial landings at Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Eastern Solomons due to refit and training. Arriving in the Southwest Pacific in early October, she raided Bougainville and supported the Marines fighting on Guadalcanal. On October 24th, she again met up with Enterprise and headed north to intercept the Japanese carriers that were coming south. 2 days later, the Battle of Santa Cruz erupted. During the battle, Hornet's first wave of dive bombers put 4 to 6 1,000-pound bombs into the large carrier Shokaku, again badly damaging her. A follow-up wave also badly damaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma. There was little time to celebrate, though. At about 9:15 a.m., Hornet was attacked by a well-coordinated strike of bombers and torpedo planes from the Zuikaku. Despite fighter protection and AA fire, she was hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes, knocking out all power and causing her to go dead in the water. Additionally, 2 aircraft deliberately crashed into her, their fuel adding to the fires. Hornet's orphaned aircraft were diverted to Enterprise. Amazingly, only 45 minutes later, even though she was still dead in the water, her fires were under control and efforts to tow her had started. 5 hours later, at 3:20 p.m., as power began to return, another strike of Japanese aircraft from the carriers Junyo and Zuikaku found her. 2 more bombs and a torpedo hit the nearly stationary Hornet, again knocking out all power and causing her to take on a 14-degree list to starboard. With night now falling, Hornet dead in the water, listing, and Japanese heavy ships 20 miles away and closing, the decision was made to scuttle her. 2 destroyers put over 400 5-inch shells and 9 torpedoes into her. Yet, still she remained afloat when they had to break off ahead of the advancing Japanese ships. When the Japanese found Hornet, salvage was obviously impossible. The Americans had clearly already tried to tow her and failed. They had also already obviously started to scuttle her. In fact, she was now listing 45 degrees to port. Take note here that when the Americans left, she had been listing 14 degrees to starboard. So, between the time the American destroyers left and the Japanese arrived, she had righted herself and started listing the other way. She was still on fire. It was also the middle of the night, so any salvage parties would have to work on a sinking, smoke-filled, unfamiliar ship that might be booby-trapped in pitch black. Most importantly, if they were to recover her, the work would have to be done very fast. Dawn would likely find any salvage ships coming under air attack. 2 Japanese destroyers finished her off with 4 24-inch torpedoes. Just after 1:35 a.m. on October 27, 1942, the burning, listing 45 degrees to port and settling by the bow carrier finally rolled over and sunk, having been hit by 5 bombs, over 400 5-inch shells, 3 aerial torpedoes, 13 destroyer torpedoes, and 2 suicide planes.